Okay, people, welcome back to another video. And we're just going to continue the Saxon genealogies. We've done the British, we've done the Irish, now we're on the Saxon. So sit back, get yourself a coffee, because this is going to take a wee while, I think. And then we're going to end it at the Saxon genealogies, and then we're going to finish off this series with the conclusion of this paper. Anyway, guys, without further ado, the Saxon genealogies. One of the most remarkable things to be noticed about the Anglo-Saxon genealogies is that so many have survived. Not only have they endured the intact ravages of some 12 or more centuries of war, worm, damp, and decay, but they've also survived the ravages of those kings whose political interests once lay in the suppression of such records, namely the Vikings, Normans, and Plantagenets. But happily, the Saxon records have survived them all, and the story that they tell is of profound interest to us in our present study. In Table 5, I have brought together, in sometimes simplified form, the genealogies of no less than 6 Saxon royal houses. It is obvious to anyone who studies the history of Saxon England that these various houses were fiercely independent of one another, and that their ambition to rule over the neighbours was always uppermost in their considerations, this often spilling over to long and bloody conflict. It is therefore all the more remarkable that the various genealogies should all hark back to the same ancestral roots. We are commonly asked to believe that these various royal families concocted these lists, and that the lists are thus rendered untrustworthy and false. Thus, we are asked to accept that, say, the House of Kent concocted a list of ancestral names that just happens to match that of the House of Northumbria, in spite of the fact that the two kingdoms were separated by hundreds of miles in days when travel was difficult, spoke different dialects, and whose subjects hardly ever moved beyond the confines of their own borders, and that this happened not just between two of the royal houses, but at least 6. To put it mildly, that is a lot to ask, and it is clear that these oft disparaged records should be re examined along with somewhat dubious conclusions that have lately been reached concerning them. The sheer plentifulness of the Anglo-Saxon genealogies allow their comparison with another, and the first thing that we notice when we compare these lists is that gaps occur. The appearance of such gaps, and they are never large, has given rise to all sorts of speculations and juggling, the inevitable implications being that here we are dealing with anything from forgery to plain fiction. Yet it is extremely rare for the evidence itself to justify such conclusions, and to illustrate the point, let us consider the following statement. Wishing to demonstrate the fact that the present royal family of England has Stuart, i.e., Scottish, blood in its veins, I shall simply state that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II is directly descended from James I. Now, the statement is not only grammatically correct, it is historically accurate also. Elizabeth II is descended from James I, but if we compare my statement to another list of English monarchs, we shall see immediately that my statement contains a gap. This gap omits 2 Charles, 1 other James, 1 Anne, 6 Georges, 2 Edwards, 2 Williams, 1 Victoria, the longest reigning monarch of all, and the Regency, 1811 to 1820. Within all these reigns, there occurred the English Civil War, 2 world wars, the founding and the losing of the British Empire, the Industrial Revolution, the South African Wars, innumerable laws and reforms, and a whole host of I know not what else. Thus, 350 years of history, all these events and much more besides, and all of these reigns are missing from my statement that Elizabeth II is descended from James I. Yet, in all seriousness, would any future critic or historian be entitled to conclude that my own integrity as a historian was thereby impunged, or that the accuracy of my statement was somehow diminished by these omissions? I should hardly think so. Yet this is precisely what happens when gaps are found in the Saxon genealogies. It is more than strongly implied that either the genealogist was falsifying the records, or that the records themselves are somewhat corrupt and faulty. Either way, we are asked not to accept them as historically reliable. We've got a wee mappy Britain there, guys, and we've got the Saxon settlements of Northumbrians, Lindsey, Mercians. We go further south to East Anglia on the eastern coastline, the East Saxons, the West Saxons, and Kent. Figure 2 is showing the areas of settlement of the various Saxon peoples, whose lineages are shown in tables 5 and 6. In reality, none of the gaps in the Saxon genealogies are as large as the gap in the above example. Usually only one or two names are omitted. An examination of these omissions invariably reveals that their importance is not such as to justify the sometimes startling conclusions that current wisdom reaches concerning them. Current wisdom, however, is governed by the parameters within which it operates, namely an unseemly, not to say unscholarly bias against the biblical record. And this bias is clearly displayed even in the highly specialized field of Saxon genealogies. For example, Kenneth Sisam, see bibliography, once wrote an extremely involved and in-depth study of the Anglo-Saxon royal genealogies, employing throughout a most complex analysis of the various names and pedigrees that he encountered. However, when it came to the lists of the various biblical patriarchs whose names appear in those same pedigrees, he dismisses them. Thus, the biblical names show the artificial character of this lengthened pedigree and the crudeness of the connections that passed muster. Otherwise, they need not detain us. This baseless assumption, so contrary to evidence, inevitably led him on to dismiss with equal abruptness everything else that he had previously written, even those lists of names that he had previously analysed and which did not contain biblical names. Beyond Serdic, all is fiction or error, and if the names themselves are old, were not attached to the ancestry of the West Saxon kings by old tradition. In spite of his previous attempt to deal with the genealogy of King Aethelwulf back to Noah and beyond by dividing it into sections. Right, guys, we'll just quickly look at the genealogical lists or tables, should we say. And at the top here, we've got Beldeg, number 7. And from Beldeg, you get Brand and Winter. So from Brand, and we'll start on the left-hand side, we get Friothogar, Friawin, Wig, Gewis, Isla, Elessa, Serdic, Kinric, Kewlin, Cuthwin, Cutha. And from Cutha, we get Keowald, Kenred, Inglid, Iopa, Yefa, Elmund, Ecgbright, Aethelwulf, and Alfred the Great. Ceda, Cambrit, Cadwalla, then Cuthgulus, Kenferth, Kenfuss, Esquin, then Sinagulus, then Kentwin, Quichelm, and Cuthred. Then from Benok, we get Alok, Angenwit, Ingen, Essa, Yopa, Ida. From Ida, we get Aethelric, Aethelfrith, Osblu, and Ecgferth. And on the other side, you get Ocga, Adhelm, Eckwald, Leodwald, Cuthwin, Cutha, Ceolwulf, Eta, Eadbright. And from Winter, we get Creta, Quedgulls, Kebed, Bubba, Beda, Beoskep, Ainferth, Eta, and Aldfirth. That is the house of Lindsey. Table 5, a chart showing lines of Saxon descent leading to 6 of the Saxon royal houses. So we have Noah, Skeef, Bedwig, Huala, Hrathra, Heremod, Skeldwe, Beow, Tetwa, Geet, Godwolf, Finn, Frithewolf, Freawin, Freylaf, Frithawald, and Woden in number 6. And we'll start from the left-hand side. We get Witta, Wicklis, Hengist Horsa, Ulsk, Imric, Ethelbert, Eadbald, Erconbert. From Erconbert we get Egbert, Edric, and Wictred. And from Wictred we get Eadbert, Ethelbert, and Alric. That's the House of Kent. Moving along to the Witteleg. From Witleg we get Wermund, Offa, Angletheo, Eilmer, Isel, Kneba, Kinewald, Creda, Paiba. And from Paiba we get Penda, Ewa. From Ewa we get Osmond, Inwulf, Thinkferth, Offa, and Alweo and Ethelbald. That's the House of Mercia. And moving along, the third line along is Wegdeg, Segegar, Swebdeg, Segegate, Seabald, Sefugil, Westerfeka, Wilgilis, or Wilgils, Uxfrea, Eif, or Yif, Elfric, Ale. That's the House of Northumbria. And the last line is Kazar, Teichman, Trigel, Hrothmund, Trip, Wilhelm, Wen, Wuffa, Teitla. And from Teitla we get Redwald. From Redwald, Sigbert, Erpwald, Regenhair. And Enel, we get Anna, Ethel here, and Ethelwald. That is the House of East Anglia. So we've got a lot of small print. We'll read after. So we'll just continue. In spite of his previous attempt to deal with the genealogy of King Aethelwulf back to Noah and beyond, by dividing it into sections, Aethelwood, Ingild, Cerdic, Wodon, and so on, Sisam ultimately recognized the fact that no one section could really stand alone. They stood or fell together. And this was why he was forced to demolish the entire structure once he had dismissed from any further discussion the biblical patriarchal names. There is a certain indefinite irrationality in this approach, and it highlights a flaw in logic that underlies the whole structure of modernist thought. Consider the following statement by James Mitchell, one of today's leading historians. The nature of historical evidence then leads us to accept the judgment of the late 19th century American philosopher William James that history is the most difficult of all the sciences because no historian can place confidence in a single statement that he makes. This sentence of Mitchell's bears repeated reading, for it is pronounced on the basis of two historical facts, namely the one-time existence of William James and a statement that this man made regarding the nature of historical evidence. Yet Mitchell was already stated that such information cannot be trusted. Under the philosophy that Mitchell has embraced at William James' recommendation, Mitchell could not possibly know for sure that William James himself had even existed, let alone that it ever said such a thing. Logically, if that's the right word, Mitchell has based his entire approach to the historical record on an assumption which he himself dare not trust, and from which it follows that his readers need proceed no further. For if he cannot trust his own statements, then what on earth are they supposed to do with them? What it tells his publishers we can only imagine. It follows from this that any system of thought that can base its most fundamental tenets upon such nonsensical reasoning can have little constructive to tell us. And if such a system finds recent history such an insuperable obstacle, then what will be the outcome when its inherents presume to guide us through the complexities of ancient history? Right, guys, got the conclusion there, but we'll read these couple of pages, these small print, explain these family trees. Okay. The above table has been constructed from various king lists and genealogies, and it demonstrates the common ancestry of 6 of the Saxon royal houses: the houses of Wessex, Occidentalum Saxonum, of Lindsey, Lindis Ferna, of Kent, Cadwalarum, of Mercia, Merclorum, of Northumbria, Northa Hyborum, and of East Anglia, Est Anglorum, are all represented. See also figures 2 and 3, and are all seen to have traced their ancestry directly back to Woden and beyond. Fortunately, Woden's own ancestry is also shown in various sources, and this goes back to Noah through Skeef, of whom more shortly, thus providing us with an invaluable and unbroken link with the immediate post-flood era. The political supremacy of these various houses fluctuated almost from one decade to the next, and the particular king who at any one time held sway over the others was accorded the title Bretwalda. The East Anglican king, Redwald 15, was a particularly famous Bretwalda, and it is thought by many that was his grave that was discovered during the excavations of the Sutton Hoo burial. Redwald, however, as well as being an East Anglian king, also belonged to the famous clan of the Woffingas. This name derived from his ancestor Woffa 14, and it demonstrates the seriousness with which the early Saxons kept their genealogies. Undoubtedly, Woffa would in time have been deified as an ancestor, as were other notable founders of clans before him, and it was only the presence of the early medieval Christian church that prevented this happening in Woffa's case. For example, Geat IV was not only the founder of the Geatingas, Beowulf of epic fame was a Geating, but he became also one of the major gods of or demigods of the Saxon pantheon. In chapter 31 of his Historia Britonum, Nennius recites the genealogy of the Kentish kings from the Hengist 10 in ascending series. Of Geat, Hengist's deified ancestor, we read that he was one of the false gods whom the Saxons worshipped. Asser tells us exactly the same thing in his Life of King Alfred. See bibliography. Geat, whom the pagans worshipped for a long time as a god. Skeldwea, number 3, otherwise Skilled, founded the Skildingas. Hoala, number 2, was remembered in one Saxon epic, Winsmith, as a most able and beneficial king. Finn, number 5, was also a famous king whose memory was revered by the Frisian Saxons of Europe, and Beldeg, otherwise Balder, was worshipped as an almost Christ-like figure, famous for his beauty and goodness and for his untimely sacrificial end. Gewis, number 8, illustrates these principles more fully. He founded the clan of Gewisse, whom Welsh annalists also knew as Gewis, Gaels, Aqu Bretons, Totam, Elam, Gentem, Geguls, Nominant. And in the charters that have survived from before King Alfred's time, the West Saxon kings were each styled Rex Gelsorum. King Alfred, however, in his translation from Latin into Old English of Bede's Historia Ecclesiasticae, suppressed the hitherto royal title of Rex Gelsorum, undoubtedly because of its blatantly pagan connotations. Had he continued the title and adopted it for himself, it would have been akin to styling himself as king of the people of Woden, and this would have been anathema to such an overtly Christian king as himself. Yet this raises a most pertinent question, namely, why was Gewis name preserved in the ancestral list of King Alfred's own biography, a biography that he undoubtedly authorized? As the founder of a clan, Gewis was, of course, an important member of the royal line, and royal genealogies, pagan or otherwise, were clearly too sacrosanct to allow the arbitrary interference and invention that we are asked to believe were so commonplace in their compilation. Other, less important names were dropped or added in various lists, so Alfred would have been expected, surely, to drop a name that had such pagan overtones as Gewis, if modernist assumptions were valid, that is. But the name is preserved, warts and all, as if to emphasize both the authenticity of the names and the historicity of their owners. Celtic, number 9, who reigned from 519 to 534 AD, is the earliest Saxon king from whom Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II traces her own descent. Ethelbert, number 11, is important in many ways, as it was during his reign that the Augustine landed in Kent in 597 AD, thus bringing the power of the Roman Catholic Church to these islands. However, it was Ethelbert's sister, Racula, who married 580 AD Sleda, king of the East Saxons, and this marriage united for the first time the royal lines of both the Saxons descended from Woden and those descended from Sixnet, see Table 6. Offa, 13, and Penda, 12, were both famous kings of Mercia, more cultured rulers than popular history would generally allow, as were all the Saxon kings. And Woden, 6, was the ancestor and archetype of them all. The historicity of Woden as once living king is seldom denied, so notorious were the Saxons in deifying their ancestors. Yet, happily for us, it was this very habit that brought about the preservation and natural growth of the Saxon genealogies and pedigrees, which in turn have provided us with such a direct historical link with the early Genesis record. That link is epitomized in Skeef, number 1, pro, sheaf, or sheaf, and he is listed in the genealogies as the son of Noah. We know the Genesis record that Noah had 3 sons, and Skeef is therefore identical to one of them. This realization, however, has led to some recent proposals that serve only to obscure and deny Skeef's true historical identity. Keynes and Lapidge, page 229, see bibliography, proposed the most astonishing notion of all, making the most of the fact that Asser, King Alfred's biographer, allegedly misspelt Skeef's name as Seth in the royal genealogy. They blandly inform their readers that, towards the end of the genealogy, Asser's Seth, son of Noah, corresponds to Sem, sick of Luke the Third. Now, there are phases of Germanic history that are, admittedly, vague, yet to suggest that there ever was a time when the Germanic races of all people wished to propagate the view that they were Semites is truly extraordinary. Anti Semitism has been an inherent feature of Germanic culture and philosophy since time immemorial. It was in no means the invention of the Nazis, and to accept such a proposal as this would have to fly in the face of all that we know concerning Saxon and Germanic culture. We would also have to ignore the fact that there exists not the slightest etymological link between the names of Seth and Shem. Keynes and Lapidge, however, were misled through a fundamental error made by Magon, see bibliography, whom they cite, likewise seizing upon Asser's alleged misspelling. Magon concludes the total effect is to make Aethelwulf, Alfred's father, by accident or design, a collateral relative of our Lord, page 250. In other words, Magon is suggesting that Aethelwulf's and hence King Alfred's ancestry was taken all the way back to Noah, Noah's son, in order to make that king an albeit distant relative of Christ, who was also descended from Noah, thus enhancing the supposedly divine nature of kingship, in particular Alfred's kingship. Yet surely The fact that all subsequent men were descended from Noah would have made Alfred no better than the common man. Magun seems to not have considered this. Ancestry from King David would have been a more convincing demonstration of Alfred's semi-divinity, if that was truly Alfred's intention and had allegedly doctored his own pedigree. Yet no such tampering is seen in these royal lines. Indeed, the comparative purity and consistency argues most strongly against the charge of invention or interference. Yet, was Asser's alleged misspelling of Seth or Skeef truly an error on Asser's part, or did Asser know something that modernist scholars have missed? The question is answered in part by one of the most skeptical investigators of modern times, Kenneth Sisam, see bibliography, who, when dealing with the identity of Seth and Skeef, is forced to admit that Leveth was usually regarded as the ancestor of the European peoples, and the possibility that the last four letters of his name have something to do with the error Seth cannot be excluded, page 316. To further the identity of Asser's Seth with Skeef of other chronicles, we have the testimony of Florence of Worcester, who wrote in 1118 AD, Seth Saxonus Skeef. In another of his manuscripts, CCCC 92, the name of Skeef is written over an erasure of Seth by a later scribe, thus showing that confusion had begun to arise, and thus needed to be sorted out, even at that early date. See Sisam, page 317. However, it follows that if Seth was a natural corruption of Lafeth, then Skeef is also identical with the particular son of Noah. Indeed, Skeef must itself have been an extremely early corruption of Japheth's name in the Saxon tongue, for it was a usage so ancient that the early Christian and pagan Anglo-Saxons were confused by it. Furthermore, it was also said of this Skeef that he had been born in the Ark of Noah, which brings us to the following point, namely, why should alleged fraudulent Christian monks try to convince readers of their present king's descent from Noah through Japheth by rendering Japheth's name in a form that would have been entirely unfamiliar to those same readers? And further, why should they then proceed to compound their folly by inventing the story of Skeef's birth in the ark? Skeef wes Noas Sunu, and he was inan their ers geboren. Rel Antic, page 173, see bibliography. Any of the readers who had only a basic knowledge of the book of Genesis would have known that Japheth was born before the building of the ark, and one did not have to be an educated scholar to possess such knowledge. Even the illiterate Caedmon, 680 AD, was familiar enough with the Genesis to compose songs and poetry about it. So Caedmon stored up in his memory all that he had learned. He sang of the creation of the world, the origin of the human race, and the whole story of Genesis. Bede's Historia Ecclesiasticae 424, Leo Shirley Price, Penguin, 1968, page 252. Even scholars of the time did not usually know Japheth under the name of Skeef. For example, when the Saxon scholar Elfric of Eynsham 955 to 1020 AD, wrote on the beginning of creation, he rendered the names of the sons of Noah thus: Ak ik will gehelden, the ein and thine wife and thine three suna, Sem Cam and Lafeth, and Hua through wife forlorn through Ert, rightwise, and me gave me, my transliteration and emphasis, which may be rendered thus: But I will save thee alone, and thy wife, and thy three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their three wives, for thou art righteous and please me. My translation. Important thing for us to notice in this passage is, of course, the fact that Elfric recorded Japheth's name in the Latin cum Hebrew rendering of Lapheth. Indeed, we find that all three names of Noah's sons are recorded in the Sixto Clementine Vulgate in a form that is identical to Elfric's rendering, thus showing, along with many other examples, that the Saxons borrowed biblical names directly from Jerome's and Old Latin versions. In other words, the Anglo-Saxons were definitely not used to transposing Japheth's name as Skeef. Therefore, it had been certain unscrupulous monks who fraudulently invented the Saxon royal genealogies, and it had really been in their own and their present king's interest to prove that the Saxon kings were royally descended from Japheth. Then it is surely inconceivable that they would have thus obscured this one vital point by rendering Japheth's name in a way that was completely unfamiliar to those whom they hoped to convince. And no educated scholar would surely have made such a silly error over Skeef's or Japheth's being born in the ark. Such an error, whether it occurred wilfully or otherwise, would have found speedy, if unwelcome, correction from any one of a number of rival schools. In short, it is clear that here we are not dealing with any attempted fraud or fiction. What we are dealing with is something with which we are already familiar, namely yet another historical account that is quite independent of the biblical record, but which it nevertheless verified to some degree, that has also become distorted with transmission and the passing of time. It is, to be brief, nothing other than a pagan memory of biblical events and personages that have been preserved and told since time immemorial by Saxon fathers to Saxon sons. The process began very soon after Babel. It did not end until the Christianization of the Saxons and their subsequently inheriting the Latin scriptural record. Even then, several centuries were to pass before the Saxons founded their own folklore in favour of the more conventional history of their newfound Norman and Plantagenet masters. Inter unerunt tre Germaniae expulsi in exilio incubus errant hors et hengest quil et ipsi fraters errant fil gutgils fil gutta fil guthka fil wooden fil frilaf fil frudolf fila fin fila fodepalt fila geta qui fult ut allant filias del filias die non ips est duas derom amen des exertum sed honest est ab idols irom quod ipsi colbunt. Strong enough evidence, surely, that these genealogies were pagan in origin rather than forged by the hands of horrified Christian monks. Okay, people, thanks for listening. And the last video will be the conclusion. So I'll see you then. Thanks for listening and have a good day. Cheers.